Teen boy helps elderly woman carry groceries. Months later, he's surprised with a standing ovation at a gala. On a bitter winter evening in downtown Bristol, where luxury condos cast long shadows over aging public housing, 15-year-old Elijah Thompson watched an elderly woman struggle with her groceries. As her paper bag tore, spilling contents across the icy sidewalk, dozens of well-dressed passersby averted their eyes. Some even quickened their pace, clutching their designer bags closer. When Elijah stepped forward to help, a shop owner immediately flipped his open sign to closed and reached for his phone. But Elijah, remembering his mother's words, "Your character is what you do when nobody's watching," kept walking toward the elderly woman, his worn backpack bouncing against his thin jacket. Before diving into this touching story, take a quick moment to let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Drop a heart if kindness still moves you. Your engagement means the world. Elijah Thompson lived with his mother Sarah in the deteriorating Oakwood Heights public housing complex, a stark contrast to the gleaming high-rises that increasingly dominated Bristol's skyline. At just 15, his shoulders already carried the weight of adult responsibilities. Sarah, a former nurse now working as both a hospital janitor and weekend diner waitress, had been fighting an uphill battle since Elijah's father was wrongfully imprisoned 3 years ago, a case of mistaken identity that the system refused to rectify. Their two-room apartment, though spotless and carefully maintained, bore the signs of systematic neglect. Water stains crept down walls, and the heating worked only sporadically. Yet Sarah had transformed their small space into a sanctuary of learning, with borrowed books lining makeshift shelves and Elijah's academic achievements proudly displayed on their refrigerator. At Marshall High School, where Elijah attended on a special academic variance, the social divide was painfully apparent. His worn uniform, purchased secondhand and meticulously maintained, marked him as an outsider among classmates who casually sported designer brands. Despite maintaining honor roll status, he often heard whispers scholarship case charity student, or worse. The school administration, while publicly championing diversity, subtly excluded him from advanced placement photo opportunities and school promotional materials. Every morning, Elijah rose at 4:30 a.m. to help his mother prepare for her hospital shift. He would iron her uniforms, pack her lunch, and then tackle his own preparations for the 90-minute public transit journey to school. The early bus rides became his study hall as he balanced textbooks on his knees, determined to maintain the grades that kept him at Marshall despite the mounting pressure to transfer him to the underperforming local school. The contrast between his two worlds grew starker each day. At Marshall, he navigated state-of-the-art facilities and dodged casual cruelty from privileged peers. At home, he helped neighbors carry groceries up broken elevators, tutored younger kids in the complex's dimly lit community room, and watched his mother stretch every dollar until it screamed. The building manager, Mr. Peterson, often praised Elijah's unusual maturity while simultaneously delivering eviction notices to families who fell behind on rent increases. Recent rumors of a massive redevelopment project cast an additional shadow over their lives. Corporate developers had been circling Oakwood Heights, their sleek cars and expensive suits appearing with increasing frequency. Each visit brought new whispers of urban renewal and community improvement, phrases that Elijah had learned meant displacement for families like his. Sarah's health had begun showing signs of strain from her punishing schedule. Elijah often caught her massaging her swollen feet or suppressing coughs, but she would wave off his concerns with a tired smile. "Focus on your studies, baby," she would say. "Education is the one thing they can't take from you." Those words echoed in his mind during the hardest days, when classmates accidentally knocked his lunch tray or teachers expressed surprise at his articulate presentations. The family's sole luxury was their Sunday tradition. No matter how exhausted, Sarah would cook a proper breakfast, usually eggs, grits, and if tips had been good, bacon. They would sit at their small table sharing stories and dreams. Sarah would remind Elijah of his grandmother's activism during the civil rights movement, instilling in him a deep understanding that dignity wasn't given, it was claimed through daily acts of quiet courage. Despite the challenges, or perhaps because of them, Elijah maintained an unwavering sense of compassion. He had learned from his mother that hardship didn't excuse unkindness, and that true character revealed itself in how you treated others when you had nothing to gain. This philosophy often put him at odds with some of his neighbors who questioned why he would help outsiders when their own community struggled. But Elijah, wise beyond his years, understood that kindness wasn't a finite resource to be hoarded, it multiplied with use. His teachers, those who took the time to look deeper, saw something remarkable in the quiet young man who turned in impeccable assignments and stayed after class to clean boards without being asked. Mr. Robinson, his history teacher, once pulled him aside to say, "You've got an old soul, Elijah. Don't let this place dim your light." Those words, combined with his mother's unwavering faith, gave him strength to face each day with determined optimism, even as the shadows of prejudice and poverty threatened to darken his path. Mrs. Evelyn Richardson stood as a fading monument to Bristol's more idealistic era. At 73, her elegant posture and precise diction betrayed her background as both a former civil rights attorney and the widow of Judge Thomas Richardson, whose mysterious death 6 months ago had sent whispers through the city's power corridors. Their Victorian home, once a gathering place for activists and changemakers, now stood in shuttered silence, its gardens untended since Thomas's passing. In her younger days, Evelyn had been a force of nature in Bristol's legal community. She'd prosecuted corrupt officials, defended civil rights cases pro bono, and established a legal aid clinic that served the city's most vulnerable residents. Her marriage to Thomas, then a progressive young judge, had created a powerful alliance for justice. Together, they'd challenged the status quo, often facing threats and social ostracism from Bristol's old money families. But their most significant battle began 3 years ago when Evelyn uncovered evidence of widespread corruption in the city's housing authority. Several board members, including prominent developer William Harrison, had been systematically undervaluing public housing properties, forcing residents out through manipulated safety violations, then flipping the properties for massive profits. The investigation had been gaining momentum until Thomas's fatal car accident, a tragedy that occurred the very night he'd planned to present damning evidence to the State Oversight Committee. Now, Evelyn lived alone in their 3-story home, its rooms filled with memories and meticulously organized files that Thomas had labeled insurance. The local power brokers, who once feared her influence, had begun treating her with patronizing concern, suggesting she consider a lovely retirement community or assisted living facility. Their transparent attempts to remove her from the neighborhood she'd spent decades protecting only strengthened her resolve to stay. The isolation following Thomas's death cut deeper than she let show. Former friends, perhaps fearing association with her controversial past, stopped visiting. Invitations to charity boards and civic organizations mysteriously dried up. Even her longtime bridge club found excuses to reorganize without her. The only regular visitors were her housekeeper, Maria, who'd been with the family for 20 years, and her cat, Justice, a demanding Siamese that Thomas had rescued from the courthouse parking lot. Despite her reduced circumstances, Evelyn maintained rigid routines. Every morning, she dressed impeccably in one of her tailored suits, applied her signature coral lipstick, and reviewed the local news with a legal pad beside her, noting connections and patterns that others might miss. She attended every city council meeting, sitting silently in the back row, her mere presence making certain council members noticeably uncomfortable. The progressive causes she'd championed were being systematically dismantled. The legal aid clinic she'd founded had lost its funding under suspicious circumstances. The diversity initiative she'd established at the local bar association had been temporarily suspended for review. Even the scholarship program she and Thomas had created for underprivileged students was being redirected to favor legacy candidates. Most painful was watching the transformation of her beloved Bristol. The working-class families who'd been her clients and friends were being pushed out by luxury developments. Small businesses that had survived for generations were closing, replaced by high-end boutiques and wine bars. The community garden she'd helped establish had been paved over for parking. Each change felt like a personal defeat, a failure to protect Thomas's legacy. Yet beneath her elegant exterior and seemingly resigned demeanor, Evelyn Richardson was far from defeated. Her home office remained a fortress of documentation. Every zoning change, every suspicious business deal, every questionable campaign contribution meticulously recorded and cross-referenced. Thomas had taught her that justice was a long game, and she'd learned patience during their 48 years together. What her opponents failed to understand was that Evelyn's apparent isolation masked an invisible network. Maria's daughter worked in the city clerk's office. Her former law students held positions throughout the state's legal system. The security guard at her bank had been a client in one of her first civil rights cases. Even now, information flowed to her through channels her adversaries never suspected. As she watched Bristol transform around her, Evelyn knew she was waiting, though, for what she wasn't yet sure. Thomas had always said that the universe had its own sense of timing and that justice arrived in unexpected ways. Looking out her window at the changing skyline, she would touch her wedding ring and whisper, "Soon, my love. Soon they'll understand that some lights refuse to be extinguished." The bitter January wind whipped through Bristol's downtown district as Elijah hurried home from his after-school tutoring session. His thin jacket provided little protection against the cold, but he'd given his warmer coat to his mother after her winter uniform jacket had been accidentally ruined in the hospital laundry. The setting sun cast long shadows between the steel and glass towers, their windows reflecting the golden light while the street level remained in perpetual twilight. The incident began innocuously enough. Outside Harrison's Premium Grocers, an upscale store where Elijah had once been followed by security for browsing too long, Mrs. Evelyn Richardson struggled with two oversized paper bags. Her elegant wool coat and perfectly styled silver hair marked her as a resident of the historic district, but something in her isolated vulnerability struck a chord with Elijah. The first bag split without warning, sending organic produce and artisanal bread rolling across the sidewalk. Premium coffee beans spilled from their gold-embossed bag, scattering like dark pearls across the concrete. Mrs. Richardson's quiet, "Oh dear," barely carried over the sound of passing traffic and hurrying feet. Not a single passerby stopped to help. Elijah didn't hesitate. "Let me help you with that." "Ma, he called out, already moving toward the spilled groceries. That's when the whispers started. A woman in a designer coat pulled her purse closer. A businessman pointedly stepped around both Elijah and the scattered groceries, his shoes crunching coffee beans into the pavement. Inside Harrison's, store manager Ronald Peterson, no relation to Elijah's building manager, but cut from the same cloth of casual prejudice, reached for his phone. Through the spotless window, Elijah could see him mouthing words that looked suspiciously like suspicious character. An impossible situation. Mrs. Richardson herself seemed momentarily startled by Elijah's approach, her hand tightening on her remaining bag, but as their eyes met, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared understanding. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice carrying the weight of old Southern propriety. "These bags aren't what they used to be." As Elijah began gathering the scattered items, a police cruiser rolled to a stop nearby. Officer James Miller, known in Oakwood Heights for his random stops of young residents, stepped out. "Everything all right here, ma'am?" he called out, one hand resting casually on his belt. "Perfectly fine," Officer Mrs. Richardson replied, her tone shifting from gentle gratitude to steel-backed authority. "This young gentleman is assisting me with a minor mishap. Your concern, while appreciated, is unnecessary." The moment hung in the air like frost. Officer Miller's face registered surprise at Mrs. Richardson's tone, followed by the careful blank expression that Elijah knew meant he was calculating his next move. More spectators had gathered, some openly filming with their phones, presumably waiting for drama to unfold. Elijah continued calmly collecting groceries, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He'd learned early that sudden movements in situations like these could turn dangerous quickly. "I think we got everything, ma'am," he said, carefully repacking the items into his own backpack after emptying it of school books. "May I help you carry these home? These bags won't last another block." Mrs. Richardson's response carried clearly to the growing audience that would be most appreciated. "My house is just 3 blocks up on Maple Street. I'm afraid my husband," her voice caught almost imperceptibly, "was usually the one who handled the shopping." As they began walking away together, Officer Miller called out, "Ma'am, I'd be happy to give you a ride home." The offer came with an underlying message that Elijah recognized all too well. "No need," Officer Mrs. Richardson replied without turning. "I find a walk with pleasant company does wonders for one's perspective on life." Her hand, age-spotted but steady, came to rest lightly on Elijah's arm, not for support, he realized, but as a deliberate gesture visible to all watching. The crowd began dispersing, disappointed by the lack of drama. Store manager Peterson disappeared from the window, though not before Elijah caught his scowl. Officer Miller returned to his cruiser but remained parked, watching. As they walked away from the scene, Mrs. Richardson spoke softly. "I apologize for their behavior. Some people seem to have forgotten basic human decency." "No need to apologize, Ma am," Elijah replied, matching her quiet tone. "My mom always says that how people treat you says more about them than about you." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Mrs. Richardson said, and for the first time a genuine smile warmed her face. "I do believe I'd like to hear more about her wisdom over a cup of tea. That is, if you're not expected home right away." Mrs. Richardson's Victorian home stood like a dignified dowager among the modernized townhouses of Maple Street. Its dark green shutters and wraparound porch spoke of another era, when front porches served as community gathering spaces rather than decorative afterthoughts. As she unlocked the ornate front door, Elijah noticed the subtle security cameras discreetly positioned around the entrance, not standard issue, but high-end surveillance equipment. The foyer welcomed them with the rich scent of old hardwood and leather-bound books. Family photographs lined the walls, telling a story of social justice through the decades. Mrs. Richardson at civil rights marches, standing beside her husband at courthouse steps, receiving awards at formal ceremonies. A more recent photo showed her with Judge Richardson, both smiling, though Elijah noticed something tense in their eyes. "The kitchen's this way." Mrs. Richardson guided him through a formal dining room that hadn't seen use in months, judging by the thin layer of dust on the mahogany table. The kitchen, however, was immaculate, a warm space with worn granite countertops and a wall of windows overlooking a winter dormant garden. "Please set those groceries anywhere," she gestured to the counter, "and do call me Evelyn. Mrs. Richardson makes me feel like I'm substituting at Sunday school." She moved to an antique stovetop where a copper kettle already waited. "Do you prefer Earl Grey or chamomile?" "Earl Grey would be nice, thank you," Elijah responded, carefully unpacking his backpack. He arranged the rescued groceries with particular attention to the damaged items, separating out what could be salvaged. "You're very methodical," Evelyn observed, preparing a proper tea service with the ease of long practice, like someone who understands the value of things. "Mom says we can't afford to waste anything," Elijah answered honestly, then worried the comment might sound like a plea for sympathy. But Evelyn just nodded. "Wisdom often comes from necessity." She set out delicate china cups and a plate of cookies that looked homemade. "These are from Maria, my housekeeper, though she's more family than employee now. She stress bakes when she's worried about me." As they settled at the kitchen's breakfast nook, sunlight streaming through leaded glass windows created patterns on the worn table surface. "Tell me, Elijah," Evelyn began, pouring tea with practiced grace, "what made you stop today? Most people seem to have developed selective blindness when it comes to others in need." The question was direct but gentle. Elijah wrapped his hands around the warm teacup, considering. "My mom works 2 jobs," he began slowly. "Sometimes she's so tired she can barely carry her own groceries. I always hope someone helps her when I can't be there." Something in Evelyn's expression softened further. "Sarah Thompson," she said unexpectedly. "She works at Bristol General and Weekends Diner. She's fighting the wrongful conviction of your father, Marcus Thompson." Elijah's surprise must have shown on his face because Evelyn continued, "I may be retired, but I keep track of injustice in my city. Your father's case." It troubled Thomas greatly. Her voice caught slightly on her late husband's name. Did you know my father's case?" Elijah asked, hope and caution warring in his voice. Thomas was preparing to review it before she trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Well, let's just say certain cases in this city have a way of being mysteriously complicated." The conversation shifted then, moving from personal histories to shared observations about their changing city. Elijah found himself describing the situation at Oakwood Heights, the constant fear of eviction, the way longtime residents were being pushed out. Evelyn listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small notebook she produced from her cardigan pocket. As the afternoon light began to fade, Elijah reluctantly mentioned needing to head home. "Mom works late on Thursdays, but I like to have dinner ready when she gets in." Of course, Evelyn rose, then hesitated. "Elijah, would you consider coming by again? The garden needs attention that my old bones can't provide, and I'd be happy to help with your schoolwork in exchange. Thomas left quite an extensive library, and it seems a shame for it to sit unused." The offer hung in the air, weighted with possibility. Elijah thought about his mother's constant worry, about the whispers that followed him at school, about the changing city around them. But he also thought about the photographs in the hallway, about justice delayed but not denied, about connections formed in unexpected moments. "I'd like that, Mrs. Evelyn," he replied. "I'd like that very much." "Excellent," she smiled, walking him to the door. "And Elijah, thank you. Not just for the groceries, but for reminding an old woman that hope often arrives in unexpected packages." Elijah's pure heart and unwavering kindness in the face of prejudice deserves a single like something he rarely receives in his daily life. Let's change that together. Over the following weeks, Elijah's visits to the Victorian house on Maple Street became a regular part of his routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, he would arrive after school, backpack heavy with books, to find Evelyn waiting with tea and an increasingly diverse array of Maria's stress-baked goods. Their initial arrangement of garden work for tutoring evolved into something far more meaningful. Evelyn proved to be an exceptional mentor, her legal background lending itself perfectly to helping Elijah analyze literature and debate historical events. She taught him to think critically, to question narratives, and to articulate his thoughts with precision. "Words are weapons," she would say, "but they're also shields. Learn to use them well under her guidance." His already strong grades began to soar. The garden, too, flourished under their combined care. Evelyn shared her knowledge of heirloom plants and sustainable gardening practices, explaining how her victory garden had once fed half the neighborhood during harder times. Together they planned a spring vegetable patch, with Evelyn insisting that Elijah take home part of the future harvest. Their comfortable routine, however, didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors began to whisper. Several times, Elijah arrived to find anonymous concerned citizen letters in Evelyn's mailbox warning her about suspicious characters in the neighborhood. Evelyn would read these aloud with theatrical flair, using them to demonstrate logical fallacies and poorly constructed arguments, turning bigotry into impromptu teaching moments. The surveillance became more overt. Officer Miller's patrol car appeared with increasing frequency during Elijah's visits. Real estate agents started leaving cards suggesting Evelyn might want to downsize to a safer environment. Even Maria received questions about her employer's mental state when shopping at Harrison's premium grocers. But the attempts at intimidation only strengthened their bond. Evelyn began sharing stories about her civil rights work, showing Elijah photographs and documents from cases she and Thomas had worked on. She taught him about precedents and patterns, about how systemic change required both patience and persistence. Justice, she would say, is like gardening. You plant seeds knowing you might not see the flowers bloom. Elijah, in turn, brought fresh perspective to Evelyn's somewhat isolated world. He shared stories about life in Oakwood Heights, the community's struggles and triumphs, the way neighbors looked out for each other despite their circumstances. He told her about his mother's dedication to her patients, even as a janitor, and about his father's letters from prison, full of hope and guidance despite his circumstances. Their conversations often continued over dinner, which became another tradition. Evelyn taught Elijah to cook traditional Southern dishes, sharing stories about each recipe's history. "Food is memory," she would say, showing him how to properly season collard greens or check the consistency of cornbread batter. These skills proved invaluable at home, where he could now prepare more varied meals for his mother. Sarah Thompson, initially hesitant about her son spending so much time in the historic district, soon saw the positive changes in Elijah. Beyond his improving grades, he carried himself with new confidence. When she managed to visit Evelyn's house one Sunday, the two women formed their own bond, sharing concerns about the city's changes and hopes for its future. The friendship between Elijah and Evelyn challenged assumptions on both sides of Bristol's divide. Some of Evelyn's former society friends, curious about her young visitor, began to question their own prejudices. A few of Elijah's neighbors, seeing his transformation, started to view education and mentorship in a new light. Yet beneath their growing connection lay deeper currents. Evelyn became increasingly protective of Elijah, watching for signs of discrimination or harassment. She made careful notes about Officer Miller's patrol patterns and documented every suspicious interaction. Meanwhile, Elijah noticed things too mysterious: phone calls that made Evelyn tense, documents she would quickly hide when he entered her study, the way she sometimes stared at Judge Richardson's photo with a mixture of grief and determination. Their worlds, though different, began to intertwine in unexpected ways. Evelyn attended Elijah's school presentations, her presence causing visible discomfort among certain faculty members. Elijah helped Evelyn navigate social media, setting up accounts that allowed her to monitor local community discussions about development projects. Together, they created a small but significant disruption to Bristol's carefully maintained social boundaries. One evening, as they sat on Evelyn's porch watching the sunset, she turned to Elijah with unusual seriousness. "You know, dear boy, sometimes life puts people in our path for reasons we don't immediately understand. When Thomas died, I thought my useful days were over. But perhaps," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "perhaps I was meant to wait for an ally who could see things with fresh eyes." Elijah, sensing the weight of her words but not quite understanding their full meaning, simply nodded. The setting sun cast long shadows across Maple Street, where Officer Miller's cruiser made another slow pass. Inside the house, Maria could be heard humming as she prepared dinner, and somewhere in the garden, a bird sang its evening song. Neither of them could have known that their peaceful routine was about to be shattered, that the seeds of change they'd been planting would soon sprout in ways neither had anticipated. For that moment, they simply sat together, an unlikely pair united by circumstance and strengthened by understanding, watching darkness settle over their changing city. The discovery happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Elijah was helping Evelyn organize Judge Richardson's study, a task she'd been postponing for months. As they sorted through boxes of legal papers, a thick manila envelope slipped from between two books, spilling photographs and documents across the hardwood floor. The photos showed familiar faces in compromising situations. William Harrison passing envelopes to city officials behind Harrison's premium grocers, Officer Miller accepting packages from known property developers. The head of the housing authority entering numbered Swiss bank accounts in a ledger. Most disturbing were surveillance photos of Judge Richardson himself, taken the day before his fatal accident, meeting with a whistleblower whose face was carefully circled in red. "I shouldn't have let you see these," Evelyn said quietly, her hands trembling as she gathered the scattered evidence. Thomas was building a case against the Bristol Development Coalition. He believed they were systematically corrupting city officials to force through their urban renewal projects. The documents told a damning story. Property assessments had been deliberately undervalued, safety violations fabricated, and resident complaints mysteriously lost in the system. The coalition's ultimate goal was to acquire entire neighborhoods, including Oakwood Heights, for a fraction of their worth. Judge Richardson had discovered that the same pattern had been repeated in 3 other cities, always targeting minority and low-income communities. The night of the accident, Evelyn continued, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas called to say he'd found the final piece of evidence. He was heading to meet with state investigators. Her fingers traced the edge of a photograph showing her husband's car, its brake lines clearly tampered with. The official report called it mechanical failure. Elijah sat heavily in Thomas's leather chair, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. "My dad's arrest, was it connected?" he asked, thinking of Marcus Thompson's mysterious conviction for a crime that had occurred while he was demonstrably elsewhere. Evelyn nodded slowly. Marcus led the Oakwood Heights Tenants Association. He was organizing resistance to the first wave of evictions. His arrest was suspiciously timed. She pulled another file from her desk. Thomas was reviewing the case when her voice trailed off. Thunder rumbled outside as they sat in heavy silence. The rain intensified, matching the gravity of their discovery. Through the study's window, they could see Officer Miller's patrol car parked across the street, its windshield wipers keeping steady time. "Why show me this now?" Elijah asked, his mind racing with implications. "Because, dear boy, I'm running out of time." Evelyn straightened in her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 73 years. "They're moving faster than expected. The City Council is voting next week on the first phase of the Bristol Renaissance Project. Once approved, Oakwood Heights and 3 other communities will be condemned for public safety reasons." She opened her laptop, revealing a complex network of spreadsheets and documents. "I've been tracking their movements, gathering evidence, building on Thomas's work, but they know I'm watching. The pressure to sell my house, the constant surveillance, the concerned neighbors, they're trying to isolate me before I can finish what Thomas started." A flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting dramatic shadows across the wall of legal books. "I need someone they won't suspect," Evelyn continued. "Someone who can move freely between communities, who understands both worlds. Someone with a stake in the truth." Elijah felt the weight of her words, understanding now why she'd been teaching him about legal precedents and document analysis. "It's dangerous," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Very," Evelyn agreed. "You can walk away. No one would blame you. You've already lost too much to their schemes." But Elijah was looking at a photo of his father included in the case files. Marcus Thompson stood proudly in front of Oakwood Heights, surrounded by community members, his face full of hope and determination. "What do you need me to do?" Relief and worry warred on Evelyn's face. "First, we document everything. Then we build a network. There are still honest people in this city, journalists, attorneys, community leaders. We just need to connect the dots without alerting the coalition." She pulled out a new notebook, its pages blank and waiting. "Your mother's diners at weekends hear things. Maria's daughter in the clerk's office sees things. The residents of Oakwood Heights know things. Separately, they're just rumors. Together, they're evidence," Elijah finished, thinking of all the conversations he'd overheard, the patterns he'd noticed but never connected. Outside, Officer Miller's patrol car finally pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the rain. Inside the study, two unlikely conspirators began planning their resistance. Evelyn's legal pad filled with names and connections, while Elijah started mapping community relationships on his phone. Neither of them could have fully anticipated the forces they were about to unleash, or the personal cost of seeking justice in a corrupt system. But in that moment, surrounded by evidence of past crimes and future threats, they found strength in their shared purpose. "Thomas would have liked you," Evelyn said softly, watching Elijah work. "He always said that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and doing what's right anyway." The idea for the winter clothing drive was born during one of Elijah's walks home through Oakwood Heights. He'd noticed an elderly resident, Mr. Jenkins, wearing only a thin sweater in the freezing weather. When asked about it, Mr. Jenkins explained that choosing between heat and medication wasn't really a choice at all. That night, discussing it with Evelyn over their regular tea, a plan began to form. A clothing drive would give us legitimate reason to move between communities, Evelyn mused, adding another spoonful of honey to her tea. And more importantly, it would actually help people while we gather information. The campaign started small. Evelyn drafted a simple flyer, "Warm Hearts, Warm Bristol Community Clothing Drive." Elijah suggested adding "in memory of Judge Thomas Richardson" to the header, knowing it would catch certain people's attention. They distributed these first at Marshall High School, where the contrast between students' designer winter wear and those wearing layered sweatshirts was impossible to ignore. Initial resistance was swift and predictable. The school administration expressed concerns about associating their prestigious institution with charitable endeavors targeting certain demographics. Several parents complained about their children being exposed to social activism. But Elijah had learned from Evelyn how to frame arguments effectively. "It's not charity, it's community investment," he explained to the school board, wearing his best thrift store blazer. "Marshall prides itself on preparing leaders. What better way to understand civic responsibility?" His presentation, backed by Evelyn's careful coaching and pristine statistics about winter health risks, won reluctant approval. The campaign gained unexpected momentum when Chelsea Harrison, William Harrison I's daughter and Marshall's most popular senior, publicly donated her entire designer coat collection. "If Elijah Thompson thinks this matters, then it matters," she announced on social media, surprising everyone, including herself. Her post went viral locally, forcing her father to publicly praise the initiative while privately seething. Collection boxes appeared across Bristol in school hallways, church vestibules, and local businesses. Each location became a potential information gathering point. Donors talked, sharing rumors and concerns about neighborhood changes. Volunteers gossiped about strange meetings and suspicious property deals. Evelyn and Elijah carefully documented everything, building their web of evidence under the cover of charitable work. Maria's network of housekeepers became invaluable, spreading word through Bristol's wealthier neighborhoods. Many of their employers, wanting to appear charitable, donated high-quality items. Some even wrote checks, which Evelyn carefully processed through a newly created community foundation, its paperwork impeccably maintained against future scrutiny. The campaign faced its first serious challenge when donations at Harrison's premium grocers mysteriously disappeared overnight. Security footage from that evening was unfortunately corrupted, according to Officer Miller. The next day, identical items appeared in a high-end consignment shop owned by a council member's wife. Evelyn photographed every piece, matching them to their donation records. Oakwood Heights residents initially viewed the campaign with skepticism. "We don't need charity, Mrs. Washington," the tenant association's new president declared firmly. But Elijah had anticipated this reaction. "It's not charity, Mrs. Washington. It's community recycling," he explained. "Besides, we need volunteers more than donations. People who know which families need help, who can organize distribution, who can spot if anything goes missing." His emphasis on community control won them over, and soon Oakwood Heights became the campaign's operational heart. The media coverage was mixed. The Bristol Herald ran a patronizing piece about underprivileged youth learning valuable lessons, but a rookie reporter from the city's alternative weekly, the Bristol Independent, dug deeper. Her article highlighted the campaign's community-building aspects and questioned why winter assistance was needed in one of the state's wealthiest cities. William Harrison attempted to co-opt the campaign, announcing that Harrison Development would match all donations. "We believe in supporting our community's grassroots initiatives," he announced at a press conference, smiling directly at Evelyn in the audience. She smiled back, knowing his involvement would make the financial paper trail even more interesting. The distribution system became a masterpiece of organized resistance. Each volunteer wore a badge with a small red dot, Evelyn's idea, marking those they could trust. Recipients received not just clothing but carefully coded information which officials to avoid, which developers were inspecting properties, which buildings were being targeted for renovation. Elijah coordinated it all with growing confidence. His mother's diner regulars became distribution points. Mr. Jenkins's senior center friends monitored council meetings. Even some of Marshall's students, inspired by Chelsea's example, began asking uncomfortable questions about neighborhood development. The campaign's success exceeded their wildest expectations. By midwinter, they'd distributed warm clothing to over 500 families. More importantly, they'd created a network of informed, connected citizens across Bristol's social divides. Each donated coat or pair of boots carried with it a story, a connection, a piece of evidence. But success brought scrutiny. Officer Miller's patrols increased. Building inspectors suddenly discovered violations in volunteer homes. Harrison's premium grocers banned collection boxes for health and safety reasons. Anonymous calls questioned Evelyn's mental fitness to manage a charitable foundation. "They're nervous," Evelyn observed, reviewing their growing evidence file. "People are talking to each other, making connections they don't want made." "Good," Elijah replied, sorting through donation records that showed interesting patterns of property ownership. "Mom always says sunlight's the best disinfectant." What neither of them knew was that their careful documentation was about to uncover something far darker than either had imagined. The warm clothing campaign had created not just a distribution network for winter gear, but a web of witnesses to decades of systematic corruption. As Bristol's winter deepened, the stage was set for revelations that would shake the city to its foundations. Chelsea Harrison discovered this firsthand when she overheard her father late one night. "The clothing drive needs to end." Permanently, the tone of his voice sent her running to her room, where she stared at her phone, torn between family loyalty and her growing awareness of right and wrong. Finally, she opened her messages and typed, "Elijah, I think you and Mrs. Richardson need to be careful. Very careful." Meanwhile, in his patrol car, Officer Miller watched another load of donations being delivered to Oakwood Heights. Through his windshield, he could see Elijah directing volunteers, each wearing their red dotted badges. Miller touched his breast pocket, feeling the envelope of cash that grew heavier with each passing week. For the first time in years, he felt something that surprised him: shame. The first sign of serious opposition came without warning. One morning, Elijah arrived at Marshall High to find his locker plastered with printouts of police records, his father's arrest, his mother's eviction notices, and every minor incident from Oakwood Heights. An anonymous note read, "Some people should know their place." Instead of removing them, Elijah left the papers up, adding his own annotations dates that didn't match witnesses who'd mysteriously disappeared, evidence that had been conveniently lost. By lunch, a crowd had gathered, including Chelsea Harrison, who photographed everything with trembling hands. That same week, the Bristol Herald published a scathing expose about questionable management of charitable donations. The article, clearly fed by opposition sources, insinuated that winter clothing was being sold for profit, with proceeds funding radical political activities. Though no direct accusations were made, the implications were clear. Evelyn's response was characteristically composed. She invited the newspaper's editor to review their immaculate financial records, maintained with forensic precision. Transparency, she said, serving him tea in Judge Richardson's study, is our best defense against malice. The editor left looking troubled. The story quietly disappeared, but the message had been sent. The harassment escalated on multiple fronts. Maria discovered her daughter's position at the city clerk's office was suddenly under review. Weekend's diner, where Sarah Thompson worked, faced surprise health inspections 3 times in 1 week. Officer Miller began following Oakwood Heights volunteers, issuing citations for imaginary violations. Most disturbing was the embezzlement attempt. A substantial donation check was altered and redirected to a fake foundation account. The scheme might have succeeded if not for Chelsea Harrison's warning to Elijah. She'd overheard her father's late-night phone call make it look like the boy's stealing. His kind always does. The attempted frame-up backfired spectacularly. Evelyn had insisted on multiple signatories for all accounts, including prominent community leaders. When presented with evidence of the fraudulent transfer attempt, these leaders began questioning other financial dealings in Bristol. Media attacks intensified. Local TV news ran a segment on youth exploitation in charitable schemes, featuring carefully edited interviews with concerned parents. Social media filled with posts questioning Elijah's scholarship status and Evelyn's mental competency. Even their strongest supporters began feeling the pressure. "They're trying to isolate us," Evelyn observed, watching yet another longtime friend cancel their regular lunch date. "It's an old tactic, make supporting us socially and professionally costly," she smiled grimly. They tried the same thing with Thomas during the redlining cases in the 90s. The opposition strategy was comprehensive. Building inspectors suddenly discovered critical violations in properties owned by campaign supporters. Business licenses came under review. Tax audits were initiated. The message was clear: stand with Elijah and Evelyn. Face consequences. Sarah Thompson was called into her supervisor's office at Bristol General. "Your son's activities are bringing unwanted attention," she was told. "Perhaps a transfer to our facility in the next county would be better for your career." The threat to her family's stability was clear. Elijah faced increasing isolation at school. Teachers who'd previously praised his work began finding faults. Athletic teams cited schedule conflicts to reject his applications. College recommendation letters were delayed or mysteriously lost. Only Chelsea Harrison still openly acknowledged him, despite her father's obvious disapproval. The pressure peaked when someone broke into Evelyn's house professionally enough to avoid triggering alarms. Nothing was stolen, but Judge Richardson's files were clearly searched, and a single playing card, the ace of spades, was left on his desk. A warning, Evelyn explained to a confused Elijah. They used the same intimidation tactic during the civil rights era. Rather than retreating, they adapted. Evelyn distributed copies of crucial documents to trusted allies across the state. Elijah developed a rotating schedule for clothing distribution, making it harder to track their movements. Their network of supporters learned to communicate through seemingly innocent social interactions. The campaign's finances were moved to multiple banks with oversight from a pro bono accounting firm that owed Judge Richardson a decades-old favor. Volunteer teams adopted buddy systems, documenting every interaction with authorities. Each act of opposition was meticulously recorded, building a pattern of coordinated harassment. Chelsea Harrison's role became increasingly complex. Torn between loyalty to her father and her growing awareness of injustice, she began secretly documenting conversations at home. "Dad's having meetings I'm not supposed to know about," she texted Elijah. "They're planning something big." The stress began showing. Sarah Thompson developed migraines from constant worry. Maria's hands shook while serving tea. Evelyn spent longer hours in Thomas's study, talking to his photograph. Elijah caught himself jumping at sudden noises, scanning for patrol cars. Yet their resolve strengthened. Each act of opposition confirmed they were on the right track. Every attempt to discredit them proved they were making powerful people nervous. The network of red dotted badges grew, spreading through Bristol like a quiet revolution. "They're getting desperate," Evelyn noted, reviewing their latest evidence. Desperate people make mistakes. She couldn't know how prophetic those words would prove, or how high the cost of those mistakes would be. In his corner office at Harrison Development, William Harrison, I reached the same conclusion about desperation. Staring at reports of the clothing campaign's growing influence, he made a call he'd hoped to avoid. "It's time," he said simply. "Use whatever means necessary. The council vote can't be delayed." Later that night, as Elijah walked home through Oakwood Heights, a black SUV with tinted windows followed at a distance. In her kitchen, Evelyn reviewed security footage, watching the same vehicle pass her house. At Weekend's Diner, Sarah Thompson served coffee to men in expensive suits who left large tips and veiled threats. The stage was set for a confrontation none of them were truly prepared for. The opposition had shown its hand, but the real battle was just beginning. As Bristol's winter deepened, the question wasn't just about warm clothing or property development anymore. It was about the soul of a city and what people would risk to save it. The exposure of Bristol's corruption network began not with a bang but with a social media post. Chelsea Harrison, unable to bear the weight of what she'd discovered, uploaded surveillance footage from her father's home office. William Harrison and city officials dividing stacks of cash, discussing problem residents who needed to disappear. Within hours, the video went viral. Chelsea's accompanying text was devastating. "My father taught me that character matters. So does truth. I'm sorry, Dad, but this has to stop." She had timed her post to coincide with a crucial city council meeting where the final vote on the Bristol Renaissance project was scheduled. The council chambers erupted in chaos when Evelyn Richardson walked in, followed by Elijah and a stream of residents wearing red dotted badges. Each carried folders of evidence, financial records, altered safety reports, falsified property assessments, and photographs documenting years of systematic corruption. "Before you vote," Evelyn announced, her voice carrying the weight of decades in courtrooms, "you should know that copies of these documents are with state investigators, federal authorities, and every major news outlet in the region." She paused, meeting William Harrison's furious gaze. "Thomas died for these truths. I won't let them die with him." Elijah stepped forward, presenting evidence of his father's wrongful conviction. The pattern was clear. Community leaders who opposed development projects found themselves facing criminal charges based on fabricated evidence. Officer Miller, sitting in the back of the chamber, stood abruptly and walked out, his face ashen. The real bombshell came from an unexpected source. Maria's daughter, finally free to speak, detailed how documents were altered in the city clerk's office. Building inspections, property valuations, resident complaints, all manipulated to serve the Bristol Development Coalition's agenda. William Harrison attempted damage control, dismissing the evidence as conspiracy theories from a grieving widow and a disadvantaged youth, but his own daughter's testimony, broadcast live on local news, made his denials hollow. Chelsea's voice shook but held firm as she described late-night meetings, shredded documents, and conversations about removing obstacles. The council chamber's livestream reached record viewership as more witnesses came forward. Restaurant servers described overheard conversations about bribes. Security guards testified about late-night document disposal. Even the janitor from Bristol General spoke about cleaning crews being used to conduct surveillance on problematic hospital staff like Sarah Thompson. Outside the chamber, crowds gathered. Residents from Oakwood Heights stood shoulder to shoulder with people from Bristol's wealthiest neighborhoods, united by red dotted badges. The winter clothing campaign had built more than a distribution network. It had created a community capable of standing together against corruption. Harrison's facade finally cracked when Evelyn presented Judge Richardson's last piece of evidence, proof that Harrison Development had orchestrated similar schemes in other cities, always targeting vulnerable communities. The pattern was undeniable, the documentation meticulous. "My husband believed in justice," Evelyn declared, her voice steady despite her tears. He believed that truth, like water, finds its way out no matter how many barriers you build. Today, that truth flows freely. The council vote was postponed indefinitely. State police arrived to secure documents. FBI agents appeared with warrants. Local news crews broadcast live as Harrison and several council members were escorted from the building. Their expressions shifted from arrogance to fear as they faced the cameras and their constituents. In the aftermath, Bristol felt like a city awakening from a long nightmare. Property owners received notices about review of past citations. The Housing Authority announced a comprehensive audit. Officer Miller submitted a detailed confession, hoping for leniency in exchange for cooperation. Elijah found himself at the center of a media storm. Journalists wanted interviews about the clothing campaign's role in exposing corruption. Community leaders sought his input on neighborhood preservation. Marshall High School's administration suddenly discovered renewed appreciation for their scholarship students' civic engagement. But victory came with costs. Chelsea Harrison faced ostracism from family friends. Development company employees lost jobs. Long-standing social circles fractured as people chose sides or admitted complicity. The city's powerful elite began a campaign of subtle retaliation against those who had exposed them. Yet the truth, once exposed, refused to be buried again. The Winter Clothing Campaign's network, built on trust and mutual support, became a model for community organizing. Red dotted badges remained a symbol of resistance against corruption and unity across social divides. As evening fell on that historic day, Evelyn and Elijah sat in Judge Richardson's study, watching news coverage of the events. Thomas would be proud, Evelyn said softly, touching her husband's photograph. Not just of the exposure, but of how it was done through community, through connection, through care for others. Elijah nodded, thinking of his father, still waiting for justice in his cell. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" he asked, understanding that exposing corruption was only the first step in a longer journey. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her eyes determined. "But now they know we're watching. And we're not alone anymore." Outside her window, porch lights began turning on across Bristol, a quiet signal of solidarity in the gathering darkness. The Bristol Community Foundation's Winter Gala was organized as a celebration of the clothing campaign's success, but it became something far more significant. Held in the grand ballroom of the Bristol Hotel, the event brought together residents from every neighborhood, economic status, and social circle, all wearing red-dotted badges as a symbol of unity. The contrast was striking. Corporate executives sat beside housing project residents, society matrons chatted with diner waitresses, and police officers mingled with those they'd once profiled. Chelsea Harrison arrived alone, beautiful in a simple black dress, having declined her family's demands to distance herself from the scandal. Evelyn Richardson made a commanding entrance, wearing her late husband's favorite color, deep purple, and carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to him. Her presence commanded respect, but there was something in her bearing that suggested she knew more than she'd yet revealed. The evening's program began traditionally enough with acknowledgments of donors and volunteers. But when Elijah Thompson took the stage, the atmosphere shifted. Wearing a new suit, a gift from his mother's diner customers, he looked every inch a young leader. This campaign began with a simple goal: keeping people warm during winter, he started. But warmth isn't just about clothing, it's about community. It's about justice. It's about recognizing that a city is only as strong as its most vulnerable resident. As he spoke, screens around the ballroom began displaying photographs: elderly residents receiving coats, children trying on warm boots, volunteers organizing distributions. Interspersed were images from Bristol's history, civil rights marches, community celebrations, moments of triumph and struggle. The mood shifted dramatically when Elijah introduced a special video presentation. The screen showed Marcus Thompson speaking from prison, recorded during a recent visit. "Son," he said, his voice strong despite his circumstances, "what you and Mrs. Richardson have done isn't just about clothes. You've given people back their dignity, their voice, their power." Sarah Thompson, watching from her seat, wiped tears as her husband continued, "They thought they could break us by taking me away. Instead, they made you stronger. You and Mrs. Richardson proved that justice doesn't sleep, it just needs people brave enough to wake it up." The surprise of the evening came when the state's Attorney General rose to speak, based on new evidence and testimony. She announced, "My office is not only reviewing Marcus Thompson's conviction, but launching a comprehensive investigation into Bristol's criminal justice practices over the past decade." The ballroom erupted in cheers and tears. Sarah Thompson collapsed into Maria's arms. Chelsea Harrison, despite her family's disgrace, stood and applauded. Officer Miller, who had chosen to attend in civilian clothes, stared at his hands, his expression unreadable. But Evelyn wasn't finished. Opening Thomas's briefcase, she revealed one final piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between Judge Richardson and William Harrison I made the day before Thomas's death. In it, Harrison explicitly threatened the judge's family if he didn't bury evidence of corruption. "My husband knew the risks," Evelyn's voice carried across the suddenly silent room. "He left this recording as insurance, knowing they might come for him. But he believed, as I do, that the price of silence is too high." The impact was immediate. Several prominent citizens hurriedly left the gala. Phones began buzzing with news alerts. Outside, media trucks arrived, their lights illuminating the hotel's facade like a stage set. As the evening drew to a close, something unprecedented occurred. Residents from Oakwood Heights performed a traditional gospel song, their voices filling the ballroom with hope and resilience. Society members who would have previously ignored such a display found themselves moved to tears. The final speaker was unexpected Chelsea Harrison. "My father taught me that reputation is everything," she said, her voice trembling but determined. He was wrong. Character is everything. Truth is everything. Community is everything. Looking around the ballroom, Elijah saw something remarkable. Barriers of race, class, and privilege temporarily dissolved. People who would never have spoken to each other were exchanging phone numbers, making plans, forming connections that would outlast the evening. As guests departed, each received a small red dot pin, professionally made a permanent version of their campaign badges. A reminder, Evelyn explained, that change is possible when people stand together. Outside the hotel, protesters had gathered, supporters of the old guard, angry about their exposed corruption. But they were outnumbered by community members forming a protective line, many wearing their newly distributed pins. The evening ended with an impromptu vigil. Hundreds of phone lights illuminated the darkness, a constellation of hope in the winter night. Songs and prayers mixed with determination and purpose. Bristol would never be the same. In his patrol car across the street, Officer Miller made a decision. Reaching for his phone, he dialed the state investigator's number. "I'm ready to tell everything," he said, watching the lights flicker like stars. "Every name, every deal, every frame up. It's time." Meanwhile, in the hotel's kitchen, Maria overheard two developers discussing emergency meetings, offshore accounts, and contingency plans. She quietly recorded everything on her phone, just as Evelyn had taught her. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was their fight for justice. As this story of courage and justice unfolds, I'm reminded of Elijah's unwavering belief in community power. If his story touches your heart, joining our community by subscribing would mean the world. Like those red dotted badges. Each subscription builds our strength to share more inspiring stories. The backlash began within hours of the gala. Chelsea Harrison returned home to find her belongings packed in boxes, her father's lawyer presenting emancipation papers with cold efficiency. "Your trust fund has been frozen," he informed her. "Mr. Harrison feels this will give you time to reconsider your loyalties." At Marshall High, the atmosphere turned toxic. Students whose parents faced investigation began a systematic campaign of isolation against both Chelsea and Elijah. College recommendation letters were rescinded. Athletic teams held practices at times that conflicted with their classes. Even teachers became distant, fearing association with the troublemakers. Sarah Thompson faced more subtle but equally devastating repercussions. Her supervisor at Bristol General claimed budget cuts necessitated reducing her hours. At Weekend's Diner, regular customers suddenly stopped leaving tips and new health code violations appeared with suspicious frequency. The message was clear: poverty as punishment. Evelyn's social isolation intensified. Her country club membership was revoked for causing distress to fellow members. Church committee she'd served on for decades suddenly had no openings. Even her bridge club, meeting faithfully for 30 years, dissolved rather than face pressure from powerful families. The threats became more personal. Chelsea discovered her college applications had been mysteriously withdrawn. Elijah's scholarship status came under routine review. Sarah's application for a small business loan to open her own diner was denied without explanation. Maria's daughter was fired from her new job after just 2 days. One morning, they found all 4 tires slashed on every vehicle belonging to core campaign members. Security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the incident. Insurance claims were denied due to insufficient evidence of vandalism. The cost of repairs stretched already tight budgets to breaking points. The psychological toll mounted. Chelsea, now living in Evelyn's guest room, cried herself to sleep missing her mother, who wasn't allowed to contact her. Elijah developed insomnia, jumping at every noise, constantly checking on his mother. Sarah worked double shifts to make up for lost income, coming home exhausted and worried. Even their allies began to waver. Some volunteers stopped wearing their red dot pins, claiming personal reasons. Others avoided eye contact immunity meetings. The solidarity of the gala evening seemed to fade in the harsh light of reality. Local media, likely pressured by advertisers, began running stories questioning the campaign's methods. Did the ends justify the means, they asked, implying that exposing corruption had somehow damaged the community more than the corruption itself. Opinion pieces suggested that some traditions and social order had value worth preserving. The pressure peaked when Elijah discovered his father's prison privileges had been revoked due to security concerns. No visits, no phone calls, no letters. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Marcus Thompson was being punished for his son's activism. "They're trying to break us financially and emotionally," Evelyn observed during a late-night strategy session. "It's an old tactic, make the cost of resistance higher than people can bear." Her voice carried the weight of decades fighting similar battles. Chelsea, her private school polish cracking, fought back tears. "Maybe if I apologize publicly, retracted my statement," she began, but Elijah cut her off. "That's what they want," he said firmly. "For us to doubt ourselves, to think we were wrong, to expose the truth." His voice grew stronger. "But Mom always says that doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy. That's why so few people do it." Sarah Thompson, exhausted from another double shift, added softly, "Your father would be proud, baby. Both of you. All of you." She looked around Evelyn's kitchen at their small, battered group. "We knew they'd fight back. We just have to be stronger." They didn't know then that their strength would soon be tested beyond anything they'd imagined, that the personal costs they'd paid so far were just the beginning, that sometimes victory comes at a price no one should have to pay. Outside Evelyn's house, Officer Miller sat in his patrol car recording another surveillance shift, but his report that night would be different. For the first time in 15 years on the force, he began typing the truth about what he was witnessing: systematic harassment, coordinated intimidation, abuse of power. His hand shook on the keyboard, knowing this report could end his career or worse. The red dot pen on his desk caught the streetlight, glinting like a single drop of blood. Sometimes, he realized, the highest cost is the one you pay to reclaim your own soul. The first sign something was wrong came during a regular Tuesday afternoon tutoring session. Evelyn's hand trembled as she lifted her teacup, spilling Earl Grey across Judge Richardson's case files. She dismissed Elijah's concern with a practiced wave, but her complexion had taken on a grayish tint that couldn't be ignored. Within weeks, the decline became impossible to hide. The indomitable Evelyn Richardson, who had faced down corrupt officials and weathered decades of social warfare, found herself struggling to climb her own stairs. Maria discovered her employer taking increasingly powerful pain medications, the prescription bottles hidden in Thomas's study. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was devastating: aggressive pancreatic cancer, already spread too far for effective treatment. The doctor, an old friend of Thomas's, delivered the news with tears in his eyes. "3 months," he said quietly. "Maybe 4 if we're aggressive with treatment." Evelyn received the news with characteristic grace, but her next actions revealed her true concerns. She began organizing files with urgent intensity, working late into the night despite growing fatigue. "Time," she muttered repeatedly. "We need more time." The corruption investigation had reached critical stages. Key witnesses were finally agreeing to testify. Marcus Thompson's appeal was gaining traction. "William Harris and I faced mounting evidence of criminal conspiracy." Evelyn had been meant to testify before the grand jury, her decades of documentation forming the backbone of the state's case. "Promise me," she gripped Elijah's hand during a particularly bad night, her strength fading but her eyes fierce. "Promise me you won't let them bury the truth with me. Thomas died for this. So many people have sacrificed for this moment." Chelsea took charge of Evelyn's medical care with the determination of someone seeking redemption. She coordinated appointments, researched treatments, and insisted on accompanying Evelyn to every hospital visit. The sight of William Harrison's disgraced daughter tenderly supporting his greatest enemy became a powerful symbol in Bristol. Sarah Thompson, despite her exhausting schedule, began cooking meals that tempted Evelyn's failing appetite. She filled the Victorian house with the smell of cornbread and collard greens, saying her own mother had sworn by soul food's healing powers. Though the cancer couldn't be cured, Evelyn's spirits lifted with each shared meal. Maria moved into the guest room next to Evelyn's, her quiet devotion worth more than any medical intervention. At night, she would hear her employer pacing, recording audio messages for the investigation, determined that her voice would be heard even if she couldn't be present. The community rallied. Red dot pins appeared on hospital staff treating Evelyn. Anonymous donors covered medical expenses. Even Officer Miller arranged unofficial police patrols to prevent harassment during her rest periods. As winter deepened, Evelyn's condition deteriorated rapidly. The woman who had once commanded courtrooms now struggled to complete sentences. Yet her mind remained sharp, her purpose clear. Between morphine doses, she detailed evidence locations, witness connections, and contingency plans. "Your generation," she told Elijah during a lucid moment, "sees things differently. You understand that justice isn't just about laws, it's about community, about caring enough to stand together." Her voice, though weak, carried decades of wisdom. "Thomas and I fought the old way through courts and committees, but you built something stronger. You built understanding." The night Evelyn slipped into unconsciousness for the final time, an impromptu vigil formed outside her house. Hundreds of Bristol residents wearing red dots stood in silent support. The lights from their phones illuminated the winter darkness, a constellation of hope against despair. Chelsea and Elijah sat at her bedside, young hands clasping aged ones, while Maria whispered prayers and Sarah Thompson sang soft hymns. They were no longer unlikely allies but family, forged in the crucible of shared purpose and sacrifice. In her last moments of consciousness, Evelyn seemed to see something beyond them. "Thomas," she whispered, a smile ghosting across her lips, "the children have found a better way." Then, with one final breath, Bristol's greatest defender slipped away, leaving behind a legacy not just of legal battles but of hearts changed and communities united. Outside, the vigil continued through the night, while inside, a small group of warriors mourned not just a mentor but the mother of their cause. None of them knew that Evelyn's death would trigger events that would shake Bristol to its foundations, or that her final gift to them would change everything. 3 days after Evelyn's funeral, Maria discovered a hidden safe behind Thomas's portrait in the study. Inside lay not just documents, but a series of leather-bound journals, Evelyn's personal diary spanning 3 decades. A note attached read, "Simply for Elijah and Chelsea, the truth needs young eyes." The diaries revealed a web of corruption far more intricate than they'd imagined. Evelyn had meticulously documented every meeting, every whispered conversation, every suspicious transaction since the 1990s. Names of prominent Bristol families appeared repeatedly, their carefully maintained reputations masking generations of systematic exploitation. "It wasn't just about property development," Chelsea whispered, reading entries about her own grandfather's involvement. "They were engineering poverty, creating desperation, then profiting from it." The clinical precision of Evelyn's documentation made the horror worse: dates, times, dollar amounts, all recorded in her elegant handwriting. Most shocking were the entries about Judge Richardson's death. Evelyn had suspected the truth but protected her young allies by keeping silent. The accident wasn't just a warning, it was an execution ordered by a consortium of Bristol's elite, including William Harrison. The brake lines hadn't failed, they'd been cut by someone following direct orders. The diary contained insurance policies, 2 offshore account numbers, recorded conversations, photographs stored in multiple locations. Evelyn had created a dead man's switch, ensuring that if anything happened to her proteges, the evidence would automatically reach state and federal authorities. Officer Miller appeared prominently in later entries. Evelyn had observed his growing discomfort, noting moments of hesitation, recording signs of conscience awakening. Sometimes she wrote, "Redemption begins with simple doubt." Her final entries included instructions for approaching him as a potential ally. Sarah Thompson found the pages about Marcus's case particularly difficult to read. Evelyn had traced how her husband's arrest was orchestrated, identifying the planted evidence, the coached witnesses, the manipulated jury selection. But she'd also documented something else, proof of his innocence that had been systematically destroyed. The most recent entries focused on Elijah and Chelsea. Evelyn had watched their growing leadership with pride, noting how they bridged divides she and Thomas had never managed to cross. They understand instinctively. She wrote that justice without compassion becomes merely another form of power. Maria's daughter's firing was explained too. She had unknowingly photographed a late-night meeting between developers and city officials, planning the next phase of displacement. The diary linked the incident to similar patterns of witness intimidation stretching back years. As they read deeper, patterns emerged. The corruption wasn't random opportunism, but a carefully managed system designed to maintain power through generations. Each real estate deal, each arrested activist, each failed small business contributed to a larger strategy of social control. Chelsea recognized names of family friends, people who'd attended her birthday parties, who'd given her graduation gifts. They all knew, she said softly. They were all part of it. The weight of complicity settled heavily on her shoulders. Elijah found hope in unexpected places within the pages. Evelyn had also documented acts of resistance, moments of courage, people who'd chosen truth over power. She'd created a map not just of corruption but of potential allies waiting to be activated. The final entry, dated just days before her death, contained a simple message to those who follow: courage isn't about winning every battle, it's about choosing to fight the right ones. The evidence is yours now. Use it wisely, use it well, but most importantly, use it together. That night in Evelyn's study, surrounded by 3 decades of truth, they began planning. Officer Miller was summoned. Sarah Thompson arrived with coffee and determination. Maria stood guard while they worked, her daughter transcribing everything digitally. The diaries weren't just evidence, they were a blueprint for dismantling decades of systemic corruption. But more than that, they were Evelyn's final lesson that true justice requires both courage and community, both evidence and empathy. As dawn approached, Elijah looked at their small group, each person reading a different volume, all connected by the weight of newfound knowledge. "This is what she was preparing us for," he said quietly. "Not just to expose the truth, but to understand it, to transform it." Outside, Bristol slept uneasily, unaware that its darkest secrets were finally coming to light, guided by the careful hand of a woman who'd spent her life preparing for this moment. The state's Attorney General called it Operation Sunlight, a coordinated dawn raid that shook Bristol to its foundations. FBI agents, state police, and federal marshals moved simultaneously across the city, armed with evidence from Evelyn's diaries and Officer Miller's testimony. William Harrison, I was arrested at his breakfast table, still in his monogrammed robe. Council members were led from their homes in handcuffs. Bank executives found their offices sealed as evidence. The investigation expanded exponentially. Each seized document revealed new connections. Each interrogation exposed deeper corruption. The Bristol Herald, under new management after its editor's involvement was exposed, ran daily updates under the headline "The House of Cards Falls." Chelsea's social media posts about her father's arrest went viral, her raw honesty touching hearts nationwide. Marcus Thompson's release came next. The state Supreme Court, presented with evidence from Evelyn's diaries, fast-tracked his appeal. Sarah Thompson waited at the prison gates, surrounded by supporters wearing red dots. Their reunion, captured by news cameras, became a symbol of justice restored. Mrs. Richardson, Marcus said to the reporters, kept her promise. She didn't let them bury the truth. The housing authority underwent complete reorganization. Eviction notices were reversed. Safety violations were re-inspected. Property values were reassessed. Oakwood Heights residents received compensation for years of systematic discrimination. The community center, once threatened with demolition, was renovated and expanded. Officer Miller's testimony proved crucial. He detailed years of coordinated harassment, falsified reports, and selective enforcement. His evidence implicated senior police officials and revealed a pattern of civil rights violations that led to department-wide reforms. In exchange for his cooperation, he received a reduced sentence and the chance to rebuild his life. Chelsea's mother, breaking ranks with Bristol's elite, came forward with additional evidence. She revealed how social networks had been weaponized to maintain power, how charity galas masked money laundering, how private school admissions controlled social mobility. Her testimony helped secure dozens of additional convictions. The Bristol Development Coalition's collapse revealed offshore accounts holding millions in stolen funds. The money was seized and redirected to community development, with oversight from a board that included both Oakwood Heights residents and reformed business leaders. Sarah Thompson's diner loan was approved first, marking a new era of equitable investment. Marshall High School faced its own reckoning. The administration that had tried to push out Elijah and Chelsea was replaced. New policies promoted genuine diversity. The scholarship program was expanded, with Chelsea surprisingly appointed to its oversight committee. Real change, she said at the first meeting, requires both accountability and opportunity. In a particularly poetic turn of justice, Harrison's Premium Grocers was converted into a community-owned market. The first customers were elderly residents who'd once been followed by security. The store's new mission statement, displayed prominently at the entrance, read, "All are welcome here." Maria's daughter was reinstated at the city clerk's office with back pay and a promotion. She led efforts to digitize public records, ensuring transparency in city operations. The red dot became an official symbol of the Transparency Initiative, a reminder that watchfulness preserves democracy. The state legislature, responding to public pressure, passed the Richardson Act, strengthening whistleblower protections and establishing an independent commission to investigate municipal corruption. Evelyn's diaries became required reading for law students studying ethical governance. William Harrison III and his co-conspirators faced lengthy federal sentences, but perhaps their greatest punishment was witnessing their carefully constructed social order crumble. From their cells, they watched Bristol transform into the kind of equitable community they'd fought so hard to prevent. At a ceremony marking the first anniversary of Evelyn's death, Elijah, Chelsea, and Sarah announced the establishment of the Richardson Thompson Justice Center, dedicated to fighting systemic corruption and promoting community empowerment. The center's first case? Helping another city's residents recognize patterns they'd seen in Bristol. The media called it a victory for justice, but those who'd lived through it knew better. It wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it was about transforming a community. The red dots remained, not as symbols of resistance now, but as reminders of connection and vigilance. Standing in Evelyn's study, now part of the Justice Center, Elijah often paused by the portrait of Judge Richardson. "You were right," he would say quietly. "Sometimes justice needs more than law. Sometimes it needs love." Outside, Bristol bloomed in unexpected ways. Former enemies became allies in rebuilding. Old wounds began to heal, and somewhere perhaps Evelyn and Thomas Richardson smiled, knowing their legacy lived on in ways they couldn't have imagined. 5 years after Evelyn's passing, the Richardson Thompson Justice Center stood as a beacon of hope in the transformed landscape of Bristol. The renovated Victorian house, its green shutters freshly painted each spring, had become more than a memorial. It was a living testament to the power of community action. Elijah, now a law student at Yale but always returning home on weekends, directed the center's youth advocacy program. His initiative, Next Generation Justice, trained high school students to recognize and challenge systemic inequality. The program had spread to 20 cities, each participant wearing a small red dot that connected them to the growing network of young activists. Chelsea Harrison, having reconciled with her mother but not her imprisoned father, managed the center's community outreach. Her personal journey from privilege to purpose resonated with young people struggling to confront family legacies of corruption. Change, she often told them, begins with the courage to see differently. Sarah Thompson's diner, Evelyn's kitchen, occupied the renovated ground floor. It became a gathering place where former adversaries found common ground over her famous cornbread and coffee. The walls displayed photographs documenting Bristol's transformation, including the iconic image of Marcus Thompson's release and Officer Miller's surprising redemption. The center's legal clinic, staffed by volunteer attorneys and law students, had successfully challenged discriminatory practices in housing, education, and law enforcement across the state. They called it the Richardson Method, combining legal action with community organizing, ensuring that justice served the people it claimed to protect. Maria continued as the center's heart, her quiet efficiency keeping operations running smoothly. Her daughter, now the city's first Latina clerk, established transparency protocols that became a national model. Together, they embodied the partnership between old wisdom and new vision that characterized the center's work. Officer Miller, after serving his reduced sentence, joined the center's police reform initiative. His insights into systemic corruption helped other communities identify and address similar patterns. The program's success led to mandatory ethics training for law enforcement officers statewide, incorporating lessons from Bristol's transformation. The Red Dot Network evolved into a sophisticated system for monitoring community welfare. When residents noticed problems from discriminatory lending practices to suspicious development proposals, the network activated, bringing resources and attention before issues could escalate into crises. Marcus Thompson, fully exonerated and compensated, chose to invest his settlement in expanding the center's reach. He established scholarships for children from affected communities, saying, "Education without ethics is just another tool of oppression. We're teaching both." The center's annual gala, now held in the renovated Oakwood Heights Community Center, became a celebration of progress rather than a display of social power. Awards recognized not wealth or status, but contributions to community welfare. The event always concluded with a candlelight vigil honoring Evelyn and Thomas Richardson's sacrifice. Bristol itself became a case study in community transformation. Researchers and activists visited regularly, studying how a city could confront its corrupt past and build a more equitable future. The Richardson Act's requirements for transparency and community input had sparked similar legislation nationwide. The former Harrison development properties, now managed by a community land trust, provided affordable housing and business spaces. The trust board, representing Bristol's diverse population, ensured that development served community needs rather than private profits. Young people like Lisa Washington, daughter of the former Oakwood Heights Association president, led new initiatives combining social justice with environmental sustainability. The community gardens Evelyn had loved became part of a larger green network, providing fresh food and gathering spaces. Regular story circles at the center captured and preserved community memories, ensuring that future generations would understand both the struggle and the triumph. Elijah often shared how that first encounter with Evelyn changed not just his life but the life of an entire city. The center's most significant impact, perhaps, was invisible: the countless small interactions that gradually replaced fear with trust, competition with cooperation, isolation with connection. People who would never have spoken now worked together on community projects, their children playing together in parks that once symbolized division. As another spring bloomed in Bristol, Elijah stood in Evelyn's study, now his office, looking at the familiar portrait of Judge Richardson. The room still held the dignified grace of its former occupant, but now it vibrated with the energy of young voices planning new initiatives, challenging old barriers, continuing the work. "Your legacy," he said softly to the empty room, "wasn't just exposing corruption. It was showing us how to build something better in its place." Outside, the garden Evelyn had loved burst with new life, tended now by a new generation of hands, watched over by the quiet strength of red-dotted guardians. 10 years to the day after that first encounter outside Harrison's Premium Grocers, Elijah Thompson stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Community Justice. The audience included activists, lawyers, and community leaders from across the country, all wearing the now familiar red dot pins. Change, he began, doesn't begin with grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It begins with simple choices: helping someone carry their groceries, standing up when others look away, believing that small acts of kindness can transform entire communities. The presentation screen behind him showed images from Bristol's journey, Evelyn's Victorian house then and now, the Oakwood Heights transformation, Sarah's thriving diner, Chelsea teaching young activists, Marcus mentoring formerly incarcerated individuals. Each image told a story of healing and hope. But transformation comes with a price, he continued. Mrs. Richardson paid with her life, as did Judge Thomas before her. My father lost years of freedom. Chelsea lost her family connections. Officer Miller lost his career. Yet each would say they gained something more valuable: their integrity, their purpose, their true community. The legacy of Bristol's transformation had spread far beyond its borders. The Richardson method had been adopted by communities fighting corruption across the globe. The Red Dot Network had evolved into an international movement for transparency and social justice. What began as a winter clothing campaign had become a model for sustainable community change. The true measure of our success isn't in the laws changed or the corrupt officials imprisoned, Elijah explained. It's in the daily interactions that once seemed impossible. It's in the former adversaries who now serve together on community boards. It's in the children who grow up knowing they can challenge injustice and find support. He spoke about the ongoing challenges, the constant vigilance required to prevent corruption's return, the need to balance justice with reconciliation, the importance of maintaining community bonds across generations. Power doesn't concede easily, he reminded them. But neither does hope. The presentation concluded with recent footage. William Harrison, released from prison, volunteering at a community center. Officer Miller training police cadets in ethical decision-making. Chelsea and her mother establishing a foundation for educational equity. Redemption, Elijah noted, is part of justice too. In the audience, Sarah Thompson wiped proud tears as her son described their family's journey. Beside her sat Maria, gray-haired but still vigilant, and Chelsea, who had found her true family in the community she once feared. They represented the living legacy of Evelyn's vision, people united not by circumstance but by choice. Mrs. Richardson taught us that justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, Elijah concluded. It's about creating communities where wrongdoing becomes less likely because people care for each other, watch out for each other, stand up for each other. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for his words but for the truth they represented. In the decades since Evelyn's passing, Bristol had become proof that systematic corruption could be replaced by systematic compassion, that divided communities could heal, that justice could be both fierce and tender. As the applause faded, Elijah touched the red dot pin on his lapel, the same one Evelyn had given him at that first gala. Every day, he said softly, we choose what kind of community we want to be. Every day we decide whether to look away or stand up, whether to accept injustice or fight it, whether to remain divided or grow together. Outside the conference center, spring sunshine illuminated a city much like Bristol had once been divided, corrupt, struggling. But in the audience sat hundreds of leaders ready to begin their own transformations, inspired by a story that began with spilled groceries and ended with renewed hope. The session concluded with a ritual borrowed from the Richardson-Thompson Center. Attendees stood in silence, holding up their phones' lights, creating a constellation of hope in the darkened auditorium. Somewhere, Elijah knew Evelyn and Thomas Richardson were smiling, their legacy living on in each small light, each red dot, each act of courage and compassion. For in the end, the greatest message of Bristol's transformation wasn't about corruption exposed or justice served. It was about the power of ordinary people choosing day after day to build the community they wished to see. It was about the enduring truth that love, expressed through action, remains the strongest force for change in any society. As Elijah and Evelyn's powerful story of justice and community touches hearts, we invite you to join our storytelling family. Hit that subscribe button to walk alongside more inspiring characters like them. Spread the warmth, share this video with friends and family who believe in the power of standing up for what's right. Your like and subscription fuel our passion to bring more stories that matter. Drop a heart in the comments and let us know, would you like to follow Elijah's continued journey in part 2? What touched you most about this story? What gives you hope? Together, like Bristol's residents, we can create ripples of change.